Erev Tov, everybody, on January 1st, as we are starting also a new Chumash Shemot, and returning to learn with the writings of Rabbi Dr. Shai Held, whose writings from Heart of Torah we studied last year for Vayikra, and after our series in Breshit with Rabbanit Dr. Michal Tikachinsky, now we're returning to Rabbi Dr. Shai Held. English text as opposed to Hebrew, so I don't have to freestyle translate. His essay is a little bit longer than hers. I think focusing on a theme or unpacking a concept is certainly common to the two of them, in the sense that, you know, the driving force is not ultimately one particular textual question or challenge and a series of answers to it, as much as, even if sometimes sparked by that, a concept or idea that we want to develop that, you know, is built out of a narrative or a law or a textual dimension of the Parsha, but to build out an idea or a value from the Torah. With Rabbi Dr. Tikachinsky, we usually saw at the end really just one paragraph, often bringing it up to the current day, in particular within the context of the state of Israel. With Rav Shai, we will sometimes see a little more of that, sometimes very specific, sometimes a little more general, but certainly applying it to the current day. And as you know, with all of our teachers, usually they will introduce us to at least one text we might not have seen before, often a rabbinic text, sometimes a medieval or modern commentary. There's tend to be two essays, I think always two essays on the Parsha from Rav Shai, and this is Shemot number 2, called Gratitude and Liberation. Let me share my screen and we'll start to read. Everyone thinks they know the story of the Exodus. No longer able to bear their oppression and enslavement, the Israelites cry out to God, who remembers the covenant and redeems them. The story of the slaves being freed is the foundational story of the Jewish people. Twice a day, liturgy recounts the experience of slavery and liberation, and once a year at Passover, Jews ritually reenact the journey from bondage to freedom. When God is revealed at Mount Sinai, it is not as creator of heaven and earth, but as the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. And when the Torah demands that the Israelites take care not to oppress the stranger, they are repeatedly reminded why. For you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. Okay, so this is the setup, the straw man of sorts, which is that the basic story and notion of the Exodus is God redeeming us and taking us from slavery to freedom, and that's a central dimension of our relationship with God, of God's identity vis-a-vis the Jewish people. Obviously, he's not going to disagree with that, but offer us another perspective. And yet, in some Jewish sources, the story takes on a seemingly very different hue. A narrative of subjugation and deliverance becomes, of all things, a tale of gratitude and ingratitude. The book of Exodus begins on an ominous note. The text tells us that a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Yosef. This is a surprising turn of events. According to Genesis, after all, Yosef was enormously powerful, second in power only to Paro himself. He effectively controls the Egyptian economy. We spent some time thinking about that with Rabbi Dr. Tikachinsky's text around Yosef's economic policies and behavior, and amasses tremendous wealth for Paro. How is it possible that the new Pharaoh doesn't even know him? But Yosef is not the only biblical character whom Paro does not know. A few chapters later, when Moshe first conveys God's demand to let Israel go, Paro responds contemptuously, "Who is the Lord that I should heed him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go." This morning I spoke briefly actually about the notion of the idea of knowing, the verb of lada'at, as it appears in Parashat Shemot, in particular with this, the king who did not know Yosef. And then at the end of chapter 2, it talks about, God saw the suffering of the Israelites, or saw them. Vayeda Elohim, and God knew them. So there we have the setup of Paro not knowing Yosef and God knowing, paying attention to the Jewish people. This takes it another step, which is Paro doesn't only not know Yosef, but also claims to not know God. And this is again happening against the backdrop of God coming to, so to speak, reacquaint God's self or take more notice of the suffering of the Israelites. But Paro does not know God. Commenting on Paro's purported ignorance of Yosef, a Midrash asks, but how can this be? For to this very day, the Egyptians know the kindness Yosef did for them. It's worth here moving over to the footnote, which you have in the end of the essay. Thanks to Shuli, the footnotes are scanned in as well. There's a lot to gain from them. We won't look at all of them. But here I believe it was this one, number 10, which says, see also Mishnat Rabbi Eliezer, Parashat 7, 137. Why is this Midrash so confident that even contemporary Egyptians know about Yosef, right? The Midrash, just jump back there for a moment. We'll see it. Well, it's the footnote on the next bit, but the question is still relevant here, right? The Midrash says, how can this be that Paro doesn't know Yosef? For to this very day, the Egyptians know the kindness Yosef did for them, right? The Midrash didn't need to say that. It could just say, how could Paro not know Yosef? Paro was living at the time when Yosef was so important, but the Midrash makes an even bolder claim, which is at the time that this is being written now, the Egyptians still remember what Yosef did. So how do we know that that's the case? Rashai asks, he says, Midrash Hagadol, that's the source he's quoting in source 10, originates in Islamic countries, and all Quran reading Muslims know of Yosef thanks to the 12th surah. Grateful to Professor Bert Vysotsky for this insight, right? So this Midrash was written in a context of, Muslim lands where the assumption, was that the story of Yosef actually did continue to be known. So just an interesting little literally footnote or aside here. This Midrash makes the claim that even in its time of writing, Yosef's story is still known, amongst a non-Jewish readership. So how can it be then that Paro purports to ignore Yosef? Rather, the Midrash answers, Paro knew Yosef, but did not pay him adequate attention and was ungrateful to him, right? This is what the Midrash that Rashi quotes says, something to the effect of Asa atzmo ki'ilu lo yada. He made himself as though he did not know Yosef. And here the color, the sort of tone of that ignoring is specifically described as a lack of gratitude. And in the end, he, Paro, was ungrateful to God as well. As it says, I do not know the Lord, right? So Rav Shai, in the paragraphs before, where he moves from the Paro who does not know Yosef to the Paro who does not know God, he's building off of this Midrashic analysis, which sees those two things textually related and develops this notion of a Paro who is ungrateful to Yosef's kindness and ungrateful to God, and that ignoring somehow connotes in particular a lack of gratitude, of recognition, right? That's sort of the bridge. The same verb is used to acknowledge as to thank. So not recognizing, in a sense, means not recognizing the good that someone does, means being ungrateful. From this, we learn, the Midrash adds, that ingratitude is closely related to rejection of God, right? And again, based on that bridge, to not thank, in some senses, to truly not acknowledge the role. And that is really to not recognize, to not know, to reject. When the Torah tells us that Paro did not know Yosef, in other words, it means to suggest not that Paro was unacquainted with Yosef, but rather that he did not acknowledge Yosef and the great debt that Egypt as a whole and Paro in particular owed him. Paro is ungrateful both to Yosef and to God. The Midrash insists that these two types of ingratitude are of a piece, and even that one leads almost inevitably to the other. Gratitude and ingratitude are ways of being in the world. The former has the potential to pervade and enrich every corner of our lives, and the latter has the power to metastasize and poison every aspect of our being. Paro's ingratitude permeates his entire world, and it drives his life in endlessly destructive ways. By the way, in an earlier footnote, on the centrality and meaning of gratitude in Jewish theology and spirituality, we have cross-references to a few other essays of Rav Shai's. Not surprising to us that gratitude is an important theme in his writings. The one time I remember him teaching at the Bayit, he spoke in the drasha slot and spoke about the idea that, in particular, we don't begin with ani modeh, but with modeh ani, that the expression of thanks precedes even the kind of identification of self, which cross-referencing internally to the Bayit's adult education, that teaching of Rav Shai's is quoted in Sarah Hurwitz's book, not Rabba Sarah, but Sarah Hurwitz's book, Here All Along, which is our book club book that we'll be discussing tomorrow night. So this is certainly a very strong and salient piece of Rav Shai's theology. The one no leftovers, the meaning of the Thanksgiving offering in Parashat Tzav, was one essay that we learned together when we did Rav Shai on Vayikra last year. Okay. What does it mean to be ungrateful? At bottom, ingratitude reflects an inability, or perhaps an unwillingness, to acknowledge our dependence on and our indebtedness to anything or anyone beyond ourselves. To be ungrateful is to be unable, or again, perhaps just unwilling, to acknowledge other people, past or present, who have made our lives possible. And traditional Jewish texts add, to be unable or unwilling to acknowledge God as the source of life. Hence, Paro refuses, and maybe at a certain point his refusal is so entrenched that it becomes an inability. This is maybe, sometimes the reading of the hardening of his heart, to acknowledge his debt, either to Yosef or to God. The Midrash goes on to imagine God exhorting the Jewish people, be careful lest you be ungrateful to me. For one who is ungrateful cannot accept the kingdom of heaven. I wasn't able to find the Midrash Hagadol, but I did find the Mishnat Rabbi Eliezer, which quotes this idea, right? Isn't it even until today, the Egyptians know the kindness of Yosef? Rather, what does it mean that Paro didn't know Yosef? It means he did not know and did not kind of pay attention to him. And kafa tovato, he was a denier of Yosef's acts of goodness. Ulbasof kafa tovato shel hakadosh baruch hu, and in the end wound up also denying the goodness or identity of God. Shama lo yadati et Hashem, as he later says in chapter 5, right? I did not know the Lord. Halamarta shekifiyat hatova hiksha l'chvira bi'ikar. And so we come to learn that denial of the good that one does, of God, presumably here, denial of God's goodness is linked to absolute rejection of God in sort of in its entirety, and continues on. And so God says to the Jewish people at the revelation at Sinai, I am the Lord your God. What does it mean? What is it coming to teach? Asher hotzeticha, the one who took you out. What does it mean, I am the Lord your God? It means I'm the one who took you out. And God says to them, be careful not to deny the good that I have done for you, because someone who denies the recognition of good that was done for them cannot accept the kingship of heaven. And goes on to acknowledge that Yehoshua sort of makes the same point in the covenant that Yehoshua establishes with the Jewish people as they enter the land. Okay, just to see that text inside.
Well, Stephen, how does he get to kingdom of heaven? Or how does the Midrash get there?
Let's see, hold on a second. Let's go back there.
Is that based on a pasuk or something?
Hold on. There we go. Shekafoi tova eino yachol lekabel malchut shamayim. Right. I mean, I think it's right. It's an extension of this idea that someone who denies the good which is done is considered tantamount. Right. It's based on the Paro example. Paro denies the good that God does, and that's considered to be like denying God's essence. But it's right. It's not well proven. Um, I guess the point is in the context of the Paro of the Moshe and Paro exchange, Moshe is talking about, a God who is doing, I mean, it's not good for Paro, it's doing good for the Jewish people. And Paro says, I don't know that God. So yeah, how does the Midrash, it's a good question. How does the Midrash prove that denying the good that God does is tantamount, right? It's sort of obvious, but I agree with you that it's not clear how the Midrash makes the link. Let's see. I guess so that going a step back, um, in the Yosef case, here's what I think is going on. In the Yosef case, let's play it through. In the Yosef case, Paro doesn't acknowledge the good that Yosef does, and the text uses the phrase Lo Yadat Yosef, didn't know Yosef. So in the case of Yosef, not acknowledging the good that Yosef did is described by the text as not knowing Yosef. And then, so we could just say the same would apply to God. Not acknowledging the good that God does is tantamount to not recognizing, not knowing God. Where it feels like it breaks down a little bit in the Midrash is how does it lead to, how does not knowing Yosef then lead to not knowing God? It's not, in Paro's case, a question of recognizing the good that God is doing for Paro, because there is no obvious good that God is doing for Paro. So it just seems like we learn from the Yosef case that not acknowledging the good is tantamount to essentially denying the existence of, not knowing the good doer. We then note that Paro goes on to not acknowledge God either, which, if we apply that rubric, means to not see the good doing of God. And then, in summary, not acknowledging the good that someone does is equivalent to not to sort of denying them. And so then when God applies it to Bnei Israel, God says, if you don't recognize the good that I did for you, Asher Hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim, then you default on Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Then you're not really knowing me. And then I guess the last step is, if you don't know me, you're in essence not accepting my authority. Does that add up for you?
I guess it seems like Rabbi Shai's translation is making it seem like a punishment, not like a natural
Right. Yeah.
consequence.
Yeah. No,
Like
I don't think we have to read it that way. I think it's saying, right, be careful, let you not be ungrateful, because if you are ungrateful, the natural consequence of that is the inability to accept the kingdom of heaven. And that's what I'm trying to offer you right now. In order to be able to fulfill Anochi Hashem Elokecha, you'll have to be able to recognize Asher Hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim.
I wanted to add that maybe Paro indeed does know the good that God did for Paro, because in Yosef interpreting the dreams, Yosef certainly made that point very clear.
That's a great addition. I see Rav Scott vigorously nodding his head in agreement. Yes, so we can say that Paro is aware of the good that God does. Say another sentence, Bernie. What was the good? What was the good that? Well, yeah.
Because Yosef says, "Umamahera Elohim lasoto," God is doing all of this.
But would you say that Paro is the beneficiary of God's goodness?
he revealed to him the dreams, or
Yeah,
he gave him the dreams.
right, and Paro is Egypt, and if
Right,
he's doing good for Egypt, he's certainly doing good for Paro.
right. Okay, good. Yeah, great. And I see Bracha has a hand also. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking that maybe the good that God did for Paro was giving him a chance to do tshuva.
Interesting. Interesting.
I'm not sure that Paro would see that as good.
Right, that's our reader's view. Okay, good. Let's keep that in mind as we read on both this essay and the Parsha in general. Okay.
Not to belabor the point, then, is Rabbi held saying if you don't accept God, then you don't accept God? If you don't recognize God, then you don't accept God?
Yeah, I think so. What doesn't
It doesn't sound like that big of a finish. Like, it sounds like an obvious point. Like, if you don't accept God, then you don't accept God.
Well, I think he's saying you could say God is the creator of the world. God, um, you know, even let's say God was the force behind the liberation from Egypt, but I don't view that through the lens of saying God did good for me, right? God acts in history, God is the agent behind things, but I'm not linking that from a perspective of gratitude to sort of saying like God did these good things for me. Is there a
I guess
distinction?
I'm not sure what the accepting the kingdom of heaven means in layman's terms.
Yeah, I think it right. In other words, it's saying right. I guess it's right because what is it from God's side? Meaning God saying, I won't accept your acceptance of me. Maybe that's what it's getting at. Like I if you're not able to view my God's role in history and in relationship as one of beneficence in which you can acknowledge the goodness that I do, then in essence you haven't accepted me at all, and therefore we don't have a relationship. Something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, keep going on a little more. Right. The Midrash goes on to imagine God exhorting the Jewish people, be careful lest you be ungrateful for me, for one who is ungrateful cannot accept the kingdom of heaven. At first, God's statement may seem like a threat. I guess this is germane to our point, right? But it really is a description. If we are ungrateful, if we don't acknowledge the reality of just how much has been given to us rather than made or achieved by us, we will actually be incapable of worshiping anything but ourselves. It is not surprising then that the prophet Ezekiel imagined. So to James's sort of question, then, right? It's not a punishment. It's just it's a statement. If you don't see a relationship through a lens of gratitude, then just understand you're not really worshiping me. It's not a true multi-dimensional relationship. It's not surprising then that the prophet Yechezkel imagines Paro insolently declaring, "The Nile is mine. I made it for myself." I think that's pretty sure that's one of these upcoming Haftorah. I don't remember if it's this week or next week. Paro's statement is the most dramatic denial possible of the fact that he is dependent. That as powerful as he is still a creature, created by and dependent on God. Another midrash imagines Paro disdainfully announcing, I have no need of God. I created myself. I myself am God, Paro implies, and I therefore have no obligations to anything or anyone besides myself. The midrashic Paro is an extreme, even caricatured case. But you don't need to be Paro to struggle with gratitude. You just need to be human. Very few of us are either brazen or delusional enough to claim that we created ourselves or that we made the world that sustains us. And yet, in smaller, less dramatic ways, many of us resist and struggle against admitting just how dependent and vulnerable we really are, against admitting, in other words, just how much we owe. Paro embodies that problem at its ugliest and most frightening extreme. Okay, so this is sort of the first half, which is setting up the Paro who doesn't know Yosef, doesn't know God, the way the Midrash links those, and in particular puts them in the framework of gratitude and then builds out the broader persona of Paro. Actually, I have little echoes of Aviva Zornberg on this dimension of Paro also, as this self-involved, centered being kind of par excellence. Now for the contrast. Moshe provides a striking contrast to Paro. At the beginning of Exodus, God hears the cries of the Israelite slaves and decides to send Moses to free his downtrodden people. Moses soon encounters God at the burning bush, and God summons him. Come, therefore, I will send you to Paro, and you shall free my people, the Israelites, from Egypt. Moshe hesitates, God insists, and then something quite strange happens. Moshe has just been assigned a world historical task. Yet amazingly, he does not immediately head for Egypt to fulfill his mission. Instead, Moshe returns to his father-in-law Yitro in Midian and asks for permission. Let me go back to my kinsmen in Egypt and see how they are faring. What is Moshe doing? Paro, or maybe, what is Moshe doing? Paro is mercilessly brutalizing the Israelites. According to one midrash, he is slaughtering and bathing in the blood of 300 Jewish infants each day. According to another, when an Israelite slave fails to produce an adequate number of bricks, the Egyptians take his youngest son and use him as brick and mortar. Moshe has been given the opportunity to free his brothers and sisters, and yet, seemingly inexcusably, he dallies. A midrash imagines an answer to this question. Upon hearing God's demand that he set out for Egypt, Moshe responds, Master of the world, I can't, because Yitro welcomed me and opened his home to me, and I have become like a son to him. One who opens his home to you, you owe your life to him. Yitro welcomed me and treated me with respect. Should I now leave without his permission? The end. So this is part one. Moshe as the one who deeply, profoundly acknowledges with gratitude that which people have done for him so much that he sees his indebtedness and responsibility to them, to the point of delaying his world historical mission to free the Jews from slavery, the Israelites from slavery, by first going to ask Yitro's permission. The end of Moshe's divine mission mirrors its beginning. According to Bamidbar, God instructs Moshe to fulfill one more task before he dies, to avenge the Israelite people on the Midianites, right? When God tells him to do that, God says, V'achar te'asef el amecha, and after that you will be gathered unto your people, meaning this is your final leadership responsibility and will bring you towards the end of your life. But instead of going himself, Moshe appoints others. He chooses 12,000 soldiers for the battle and sends them out under the leadership of his grandnephew Pinchas. A rabbinic commentary expresses surprise. God says, you go, and he sends others in his place? It then explains, Moshe did this because he grew up in Midian and reasoned, it is not right that I afflict them, since they were good to me. The parable says, do not throw stones into a well from which you have drunk. Moshe displays gratitude when God assigns him his first task, and he does so again when God assigns him his last. Moshe's life, the Midrash implies, is animated by gratitude from beginning to end, right? And we can sort of say about these Midrashim, almost even more than the Paro side, they're building out something which is not obviously present in the text. It's not Moshe's most central characteristic, gratitude. And so they're sort of really developing a character dimension to him that's not as obvious. Quietly, subtly, rabbinic tradition thus casts the story of Exodus in a dramatic new light. The clash between Moshe and Paro is not just a struggle between the Israelite slaves and their Egyptian lords, nor is it just a battle between God and Paro. The clash between Moshe and Paro is also a war between gratitude and ingratitude. When Moshe refuses to go to Egypt before he secures Yitro's permission, he is not just fulfilling a personal obligation, though he is surely also doing that. He is tacitly saying it would be inappropriate for me to lead the Israelites out of this bastion of ingratitude by first behaving like an ingrate myself. I am going to model a radically different way of living. I'm going to lead like the anti-Paro and model what a life of gratitude could look like. This may be precisely why God chooses Moshe to lead the Israelites in the first place. In the end, only a person who truly understands and embodies the quality of gratitude can lead the slaves out of Egypt, an abyss of cruelty fueled by pervasive ingratitude. God's hope then is not just that the Israelites will leave the political oppressions of Egypt, but also that they will leave behind the culture that makes such oppression possible. And for that, they need a leader who embodies a life oriented by gratitude. And he points out that this sort of broad development of gratitude as sort of essential to redemption comes from an article of Rav David Dov Levanon, or runs in parallel. And this was sort of the new discovery, the big major new discovery for me from this essay. Says in footnote 11, for the idea of juxtaposing Moshe and Paro as paragons of gratitude and ingratitude, for many of the references cited in this essay and for much of the flow of the argument, I'm indebted to Moshe Yechiel Tsuriel, Otzrot HaMusar. I had not heard of this individual, but I found him, and he's a landsman of sorts, not exactly, but at some phase of his life. Just a quick little piece of his bio. Rav Moshe Yechiel Tsuriel Halevi Weiss. This is him, photo pictured there. Born in Germany before the Shoah, 1938, and his family fled to the United States, where he learned in Ner Yisrael in Baltimore, under the leadership of Rabbi Ruderman, and also, like my father, learned at Loyola College in Baltimore, University in Baltimore, and completed his degree in educational psychology, served as a shul rabbi in Newark, Delaware, and in 1956 made Aliyah, and learned, I think, in Yeshivat Merkaz Harav, and learned with Rav Eliezer Waldman, alongside Rav Tzvi Yehuda Cook, and under the tutelage of the Nazir, and then completed his university studies, returned to Israel, got married, and then taught in various yeshivot over many years. And his kind of main Torah contribution, what this second big paragraph talks about, is his major Torah contribution was sort of creating anthologies and highlight books, essentially. So he would have like the best of the Rashbam, the best of, the Maharal, etc., sort of like an aggregator of, interesting and novel teachings of some of the greats across the centuries. And in this major work, Otzrot HaMusar, he works through different themes and topics and ideas, character traits, and collects lots and lots of sayings from the Musar greats on those topics. So in the section, let's see if I have it here. Yes, this is page 500 of volume 1 of Otzrot HaMusar of Rav Moshe Yechiel Tsuriel. He has an entry on Hakarat Tova, what we now call Hakarat HaTov. And that's where a lot of the sources that Rav Shai drew from, put into this essay were drawn from. I have yet to ask Rav Shai how he came across Rav Tsuriel, but it was a wonderful discovery for me through him as well. Okay, by this point, readers may be tempted to protest that they want their Exodus back. How and why has the Jewish people's grand narrative of slavery and liberation, and for that matter, Western civilization's paradigmatic story of slavery and liberation, been reimagined as a story about something ostensibly less potent and less urgent? What is the relationship between oppression and freedom on the one hand, and gratitude and ingratitude on the other? And why has rabbinic tradition seemingly made a decision to conflate them? Now, I think we should say for a moment, that this is Rav Shai, in his homiletic sermonic quality, exaggerating a little bit. In other words, I don't think anyone understands that the rabbis, through this handful of midrashim, have turned the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim into primarily a story about gratitude and ingratitude. That would be excessive to suggest. But he wants to draw our attention to the fact that they've introduced this as a more than trivial theme within this narrative, where it doesn't pop off the page in the Pshat otherwise. So what of the linking of the two? I'll say it in a more modest way. First, recall what I have already suggested. Paro's ingratitude and his inhumanity share the same root, namely his refusal to see other people and to acknowledge the ways that he and his people are dependent upon them. One of the tragic and potentially horrific consequences of ingratitude is the sense that nothing outside of me makes a claim on me. Since ingratitude is the insistence that I don't owe anybody anything, it can blind me to the reality and dignity of other people. Being ungrateful can thus be both a symptom and a cause of inhumanity, and the two have the potential to feed off of one another in a dangerous downward spiral. Remember the Midrash's observation, one that James queried, that one who is ungrateful cannot accept the kingdom of heaven. If the Israelites are to accept the kingdom of heaven, that is, if they are to serve the real God, rather than be enslaved by shameless pretenders, then the leader who guides them must himself embody the character trait that most makes such acceptance possible. No gratitude, no relationship to God. It is no coincidence that Moshe and Paro represent gratitude and its antithesis. The chasm between them is fundamental to the story and part of what gives it life. Unbridled self-assertion and a refusal to acknowledge indebtedness to anyone or anything else are what underlie Paro's rule and his way of being in the world. Acknowledgement of others and a willingness to face his own indebtedness, on the other hand, are what underlie Moshe's leadership and his way of being in the world. I think that's also an interesting assertion. Is that a full description of Moshe's leadership? In 14, he says, as my colleague Rabbi Jason Rubenstein points out, also former Riverdalian, Moshe's deep sense of gratitude is also a crucial part of what enables him to escape the trap of becoming a new pharaoh to the liberated Israelites. So, but again, I think I don't know if this is the central quality of Moshe, or Scott's saying, "Come on, you overdid it." Okay, fine, I agree. But all right, acknowledgement of others and a willingness to face his own indebtedness are part of Moshe's leadership, a dimension of his way of being in the world. The liberation of the Israelites from Egypt is a liberation from a mode of seeing the world and living in it, at least as much as it is an escape from concrete political circumstances. Moshe returning to Yitro before he heads for Egypt then is integral to the story of Israel's liberation. They are about to embark on a journey toward a culture of gratitude and reciprocity, and Moshe leads the way. Leaving a place of ingratitude is leaving a place of enslavement in another crucial sense as well. It is not just that those who are devoid of gratitude may feel licensed to dehumanize others, but also that ingratitude itself constitutes a kind of prison. I like this teaching. If we refuse to be grateful, we close ourselves off from the possibility of real relationship and connection to others. To be ungrateful is to be stuck inside ourselves, to be shackled in a prison of our own making. It is like living in a form of solitary confinement. Conversely, to be grateful is a powerful manifestation of freedom, the freedom to live a life infused by mutuality and reciprocity. In allowing ourselves to be grateful, we free ourselves from the prison of our own self-enclosure and become available to meet and be met by others. So I think, maybe some consensus that, and I feel we've had this claims on Rav Shai before, maybe overdone, maybe made a bigger case out of a few midrashim than we might naturally make, but certainly introduced to us the additional dimension of this story around gratitude and ingratitude. Yeah, Rav Scott, please.
So I have a couple of thoughts about the whole issue of Paro's ingratitude. It just seems so obvious to me that as someone who is supposed to be an omnipotent leader and who is supposed to be an Egyptian god, it's not so surprising that he doesn't recognize any other god and doesn't recognize his obligation to be grateful to Yosef for whatever Yosef did. So I mean, I don't think that's a big surprise. Um, one of the things that I was um, wondering was why, in his argument about the need to be grateful, Rav Shai doesn't mention the fact that um, we are not supposed to oppress or subjugate other people because we were slaves in Egypt. And it always seemed to me that a big part of that was that even though we were slaves, we owed the Egyptians at a time when when the world was starving, they took us in. Um, and we were treated pretty well for a very long time until we weren't. Um, I guess it's the story of our lives every place. But um, it has always struck me that that's one of the reasons that rule is so important, that we love the stranger because we were strangers. Um, and we know what it's like um, to be welcomed by people and also be rejected by them.
I'd say meaning what was the way that you were looking to see him introduce that?
When he's talking about gratitude,
Mm-hmm.
that Bnei Israel, that there's an element of that in the notion that Israel is to remember that they were slaves in Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what that means isn't just the subjugation, but also the first part of it.
Yeah.
And maybe, we need to learn that
Yeah.
we should be grateful for that.
Right. Right. Yeah. So it's good because I think it's an interesting point. I'll just share my screen again and note that hold on a second. There we go. That yes, he includes that idea of not oppressing the stranger because you were strangers in the lands of Egypt in his kind of you know
In the earlier part,
exactly in the earlier
but,
part, and
but
you're
he doesn't connect it to the gratitude
right,
part.
right, and I think you're pointing out that it could be utilized as a support for that argument as well. Yeah, yeah, great. See, James chatted in. Yes, yeah. Isn't it mentioned in the Torah that we owe the Egyptians? Meaning beyond James, beyond that pasuk?
Is there something in Deuteronomy like we have to something about accepting them or giving them something because they gave us or treating them differently than we treat other?
Let's see.
Maybe it's the section where it's talking about who can marry whom.
Right.
Oh yeah.
Right. I was thinking about that. Let's see. There. Yeah, there it is. Dvarim 23:8. I can share the screen again for a moment.
Why are you looking in Safari at Bernie's online?
I didn't want to make him read through starting in Dvarim 20. That's where I started. I can't put Bernie on that fast of a fast forward.
I was starting in Bereshit Aleph.
Here it is. Lo tata'iv adomi ki achichahu, lo tata'iv mitzri ki ger hayita ve'ot. So, right. Don't abhor an Edomite, for he is your kinsman. Do not abhor an Egyptian, for you were a stranger in his land.
And the children born to them should be admitted.
Right.
Hmm.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. Good connection. Well remembered and noticed. Great.
I would also I mean, the idea that um, he asserts that Moses's um, gratitude is so overwhelming, sort of ignores most of Dvarim and other parts of the Torah where the Israelites aren't behaving themselves so well, and he complains. And so,
Yeah, 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 exactly. Yeah, no, I think again the characterization of Moshe as, yeah, the way he said it, the theme that underlies his leadership is acknowledgement of the other and gratitude. I might pick a few other words as the top two or three for Moshe. That might not be one of them, but
little exaggeration.
yeah, 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 yeah. Great. Other questions or comments before we wrap up? All right, we're in the saddle with Sefer Shemot and Rav Shai, and looking forward to continuing. Oh, Dad, yes.
So this isn't gratitude. It's you shouldn't oppress the stranger because you were strangers in Egypt. So how do we remember that we were slaves? And the Torah actually pictorializes it. If you look at Shir, this is the song that we sang as we came across the Red Sea and put the Egyptians behind us. It's written as brickwork.
Mm-hmm.
And every time, not every sitter actually prints it that way. I think they should, because every time you say that every day, you're reminded that we used to make bricks and we used to build storehouses with those bricks. We were slaves, and you can see it. You're reminded of that every day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautiful. Dad, did you know Rav Moshe Tzuriel from Loyola? He was a little before you, I think.
No. He if he was in near Israel, he was going to Loyola at night.
Mm-hmm.
So near Israel had agreements with both Johns Hopkins and Loyola that near Israel students could go there and take classes and towards a bachelor's degree. And so that's where he was. I was in the day school as opposed to the night school.
Well, just to see he died only earlier this year in August.
Well,
So a figure for me worth learning a little more about. Um, great. All right, everybody, wishing a good week ahead and looking forward to continuing next week. Tati James, yeah, I'll ask Rev Shai. We'll find out what his budget is for joining for a session. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Love to mom and dad. Good night to all. Bye.